Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are as you hear these words. I am Stephen O'Grady. I am the co-founder of Redmond. Redmond, if you have not heard of us, is a developer-focused industry analyst firm. And what that means in practice is that we spent a lot of time thinking about essentially developer needs, developer preferences, developer trends, because it's our belief that that is essentially what's driving the technology industry today. And what we wanted to talk about essentially was something that we've come to call the developer experience gap. Now, we'll get into what that means. We'll get into sort of the particulars and at the end of the presentation, some things that we think can be done to address it. But just at the top, I think it's worth, just spending a second to talk about why, we think it's an issue, to talk about sort of the level of the problem. And, one of the things you probably won't be surprised to hear as a developer-focused industry analyst firm is that we spend a lot of time talking to developers. And, one of the things that has come up over and over and over again in our conversations, with practitioners, frankly, across the board, is this sort of low-level friction. This essentially these issues that are always there that tend to fall in between the cracks. And it's the kind of thing that we, as an industry, and certainly developers, sort of more particularly, have tried to learn to live with, to some extent. And, because there's an element of this where developers being developers, they've automated everything they can. Right? And so any aspect of the experience that can be attacked programmatically has been, and yet there sort of remains these gaps, if you will, between the different tools and between sort of the pieces that we use to build infrastructure today. And the result is just a really subpar experience. And so we'll get into sort of why that is and how that is, and as I said before, what we think might be done or might be possible to do to address it. So the first step is, when we think about sort of the experience, right? What does that mean? When we talk about experience, what do we mean? And the example that we tend to use is, so this is Steve Jobs on stage in January of 2007. And he's introducing the iPhone. Surprisingly, I thought it would look a lot different, than it does today. And of course it is different, but not as radically as you might expect. But anyhow, sort of focusing sort of more particularly on, the example here, prior to January of 2007, we obviously had, we had music players, we had cameras, we had phones, we had all the sort of different things that make up an iPhone. And in some cases, we had them on the same device, right? There were phones that would play music and so on. And if you think about the experience that you were used to, at least those of you who, those of you who've been around long enough to remember those, it was almost as if these tools had been designed by, completely different teams that had nothing to do with each other, right? So, the music and phone just wouldn't work together because they weren't designed that way, which is what made that experience with the first iPhone, so memorable, right? So, so novel, frankly. It was a revelation. And, so, everybody, I would assume, listening to this has had some experience with this at some point. It's very difficult to get away from phones. Is that, you're listening to music, a call comes in. So what happens? The music fades out. You pick up the call. When you're done with the call, the music fades back in. Now, on paper, this is pretty simple, right? This is, this is exactly how we would, draw this up. This is not rocket science. This is not, some impossibly complicated, experience to deliver. And yet it just wasn't the standard. And it wasn't the standard because, we had all these individual pieces that had to be integrated together. And there was, much less oversight of what experience do these pieces in the aggregate deliver to an end user. And that was, and sort of arguably still is, sort of Apple's genius. It's not a matter of, hey, I could deliver the best music player or the best phone or the best camera or whatever. They are thinking about sort of the experience qualitatively in terms of, okay, what is it like to use these individual pieces in conjunction with one another in the aggregate? And, that is something that, has, it's a lesson, frankly, that this industry still needs to learn on some level. Which brings us to Heroku. Now, Heroku, many of you sort of may be familiar with. It's a property currently owned by Salesforce, bought by Salesforce in 2010. It was founded way back in 2007. And, what Heroku represented from an industry standpoint was essentially a break, from the norm at the time. So about 5 months before Steve Jobs stood on stage with his iPhone, the folks from Amazon came out with a couple of different primitives, if you will. First, it was storage in March of 2006, the simple storage service S3. Later in August of 2002 was the Elastic Compute Cloud. These two services, basically kicked off the cloud era, right? And obviously they've been followed by not dozens, but literally hundreds of different services, which is in itself an issue, as we'll talk about. But, that was sort of the advent of this, era, which was dominated by, here are the primitives, you developer, use them and go build what you will. Heroku represented a sort of fundamentally different approach, which said, okay, what if we took some off-the-shelf, projects and technologies, things like the Postgres database, Rails as a framework, Git as a versioning and deployment mechanism, and brought them together to deliver a different quality experience. To try to think about not just, hey, how does Git or Postgres or Rails or whatever work individually, but what is the experience overall that they represent to customers? So, Heroku has done fine. It's too constrained, it's too opinionated, for many in the industry. But it has consistently throughout the years, delivered a certain quality of experience. Now, the interesting thing to us at Redmond is that, when we look at this, we are in a position where, Heroku represents, a certain ideal, but certainly it's not as if it's taken over the industry. It's not as if it's ubiquitous. And yet, over the last, probably about 18 months, we've heard more chatter, in the industry. We've been asked more about Heroku than the entire decade prior. So what accounts for this sort of otherwise inexplicable surge in interest? It's otherwise, really surprising and unexpected, renaissance of Heroku, not even necessarily as a company, but as an idea. And, we have a couple ideas on that. So on the one hand, if you think about the world that we live in today, it's a golden age for developers, right? In the sense that, we talked about the primitives that Amazon launched, which kicked off the cloud era. So anything you want as a managed service, compute, storage, database, sort of what have you, you can have as a managed service. And importantly, there are more arriving by the day, right? So my colleague James Governor talks a lot about progressive delivery, which is this idea that, you can, test things progressively, sort of across, rollouts, so, blue-green deployments, canary rollouts and so on and so forth. It used to be that you'd have to build that, if you wanted that kind of functionality. Now, it's just available to developers, who want it. And, there are many other sort of contributing factors here. Open source continues to explode, of course. We have this huge array of projects at our disposal that, represent a huge, essentially win, for developers, right? Because they have this essentially inexhaustible library of assets and resources and services they can bring to bear on any given problem, which is great. But, one of the issues is that it is not an unmitigated good. So, if you are a Gen Xer and you grew up in the United States, I have no idea how this plays in other geographies, you might recognize the source of this GIF. If not, it's from a 80s television show called The A-Team. And for reasons that I don't understand at all, there was a montage sequence in every episode of The A-Team in which they had to get together and take all these individual parts, corrugated iron or iron there, some regular flat pieces of metal, cones, whatever, and they had to weld it, screw it, duct tape it, wire it together to form whatever. I think in this case it was like a tank. Who knows? The point is that this was taking a bunch of primitives and assembling them by hand to build something else. And that effectively is what we have told developers they have to do and they have to be. The industry, certainly as long as the cloud has been around, has de facto told developers you have to be the A-Team. You got to take all these pieces, you have to put them together, and not just put them together, but you are responsible for their assembly, but also their operation, their maintenance, and their support over the long term. And that is just it's a problem because what you end up with, is essentially you end up with a gap, right? You end up with, well, okay, I have these individual pieces, and then collectively they don't work all that well together, right? I have this constant low-lying friction of trying to make these pieces work together, of trying to be responsible for operating them, of trying to be responsible for their integrations. And, we're back to a world where I have a music player and I have a phone, and nobody's really thought well about how to sort of make these two pieces work together. So, then the logical question is, okay, even if we sort of acknowledge that this is a problem, who cares? Like, why is this important? And, really what we tell people is that it's important for a very simple reason, right? Which is that, this is a quote from Andy Jassy. Andy is obviously going to be the next CEO of Amazon. But this is, from his time at AWS. And it's a quote from a couple of years ago. And what it essentially says is that the success of AWS is and has been delivered by developers. Developers are the driving engine of Amazon, AWS more specifically, as an organization. And I think it's reasonable. I think we can probably all agree that Amazon is not a small organization, and that Amazon is sort of in many cases driving trends that impact and affect the entire industry. So if developers are as important to Amazon as they are to sort of the industry as a whole, then sort of logically you would infer that they are an enormously important constituency for everybody, regardless of where you work, regardless of what kind of organization you're a part of. So if developers are that important, therefore, well, one of the things you might want to do is try to eliminate friction, from their day, from their process. And, that is something that, you will, sort of want to take a look at, sort of over the longer term, because, one, if you can, sort of get them, get developers focused on, sort of what, the basically writing code. If you can address the developer experience gap for them, they're going to spend less time duct taping, baling, wiring, welding, and so on, and more time writing code that makes them happy, it makes them productive. So they're happier, your organization moves more quickly, and therefore everybody wins. So if we can acknowledge that this is a problem, if we can acknowledge that the problem is important, the logical next question is, what do we do about it, right? And, there isn't going to be one answer, right? There's not going to be sort of one solution to this. There's not even going to be one approach to this. There are going to be a bunch of them. We don't have time to talk about all those today. What we do have time to talk about, however, is characteristics of what we feel, solutions, regardless of sort of what approach they take, are going to have in common. And the first of these is that they have to be comprehensive, right? So the days of sort of being able to sort of just focus on one tiny area of the developer tool chain, and try to be so focused on that you're ignorant to everything that's going on around you, those days need to be over. Right? You can't just come in and say, I only do this one thing. Whatever happens outside of this particular space is somebody else's problem. That's not going to work. So the solutions themselves have to be comprehensive. Now, it doesn't mean that any one vendor is going to be able to offer everything that's required. That's not likely to happen anytime soon. But the solutions have to at least be sort of self-aware enough to say, look, people often use this service in conjunction with these 2, 3, 4, 5 other services. And I need to go further than just hey, we have a partnership and the APIs work together. You need to think about what is the actual experience of using these things together, right? Because we've all had that, we've all had that experience at some point where, you're using, sort of pieces of software, and there is theoretically an integration. And you're sitting there saying, has anybody actually used this? Has anybody actually tried this? And, it's such a common sort of breakdown in experience these days that, literally anything that is sort of more thoughtfully approached and integrated is really going to turn heads. So the solutions here can't be sort of siloed. They have to be comprehensive in nature. So likewise, they have to be developer native. So what does that mean? Well, this, the background here is a tool called MARP. What MARP is a tool that, essentially does slides. You can output slides in PowerPoint or PDF or a variety of image formats, but you design the slides in the context of Visual Code or Visual Studio Code. Sorry. So basically it's a developer native slide tool. For lack of a better term. And this is the standard, it's not, we don't obviously need to focus on slides. It's not the developer's primary output. But the example here, I think, is worth emphasizing because basically you're going to want to work with, the tools that are popular and used by developers, VS Code being sort of, perhaps one of the best examples in the industry today. The days of being able to say, hey, I have this interface, you come to me, again, are over. Whatever the solutions here are going to be, they're going to have to be natively integrated into the tools that a developer is going to use day to day. They have to be developer native by design. Likewise, they have to be elegant, right? So if you think back to that, the iPhone example that we used earlier, that is, sort of inarguably an elegant solution, right? It is just simple. It's, a solution that is delightful, from a user standpoint, because it works how you'd expect. The music fades out, take a call, music fades back in. It's not brain surgery. It's not rocket science, but it is an elegant, tasteful solution. And the thoughtfulness of that design comes through. And that's always been appreciated by developers. It is, if you look around the industry at platforms that have been successful, if you take a GitHub as an example, GitHub is a lot more than just, hey, we can host your Git repos. Right? GitHub has, done many things over the years, that are, elegant in nature, right? The aesthetics that go into it, the thoughtfulness of the design, for the tooling, which is not to say it's always perfect, but those are the kinds of things that are appreciated, by developers, that sort of elegance and thoughtfulness and sort of attention to the aesthetics, are going to matter and are going to be important to include and to think about and to focus around, as we think about, solutions, for this developer experience gap. Likewise, it needs to be multi-runtime. If you were designing a solution, frankly, if you go back to 2007, when Heroku was first developed, then you could design, single or sort of very few runtime solutions because that was the standard. Many, many years ago, when I was out sort of as a systems integrator myself, most of the shops I dealt with were either Java shops or Microsoft shops. It might do a little bit of both. And of course, there's always, tons of other stuff running in the background that nobody pays enough attention to, Perl and otherwise. But basically, most of these shops were, 1 or 2 runtimes tops in terms of sanctioned languages. That's just not the case any longer, right? So the backdrop for this is the plot that we produce, twice a year for our Redmond programming language rankings. And as you can see, when you look up at the upper right hand of this chart, excuse me, there are a number of different, examples of languages that are enormously popular, right? So JavaScript obviously is sort of taken over the world. Python and Java are huge, but go further down the chart. Dart and Rust are 2 languages for us that are coming up. Kotlin has already done that. Go did that sort of before, and TypeScript is a huge gainer. So the point here is that whatever the solutions are going to be, excuse me, they're absolutely going to be multi-runtime in nature. You're going to have to support the different languages and the different runtime platforms that developers want to use. Certainly don't need to support every one on this chart, but you're going to have to be pretty flexible in terms of what you accommodate. And then lastly, we've already sort of touched on the fact that it is extremely unlikely that any single vendor is going to deliver everything that's required for a sort of integrated developer native toolchain. There's just too many moving pieces, too many services. Excuse me. So it's just not going to happen. Therefore, nobody's going to be in the position of Apple, right, where they control the runtime, they control the music player, and they control the phone app. What's going to be required is a bunch of vendors are going to need to come together and think about, again, sort of a wider world than just their particular space, and think about the experience. What is it like to use these together? How does that work? How elegant, how thoughtful, how comprehensive is that experience? And that ultimately is going to be, what's going to define winning workflows from losing workflows, regardless of approach. So with that, and not least because I appear to be losing my voice, that is essentially what we're thinking about the developer experience gap at present, and some suggestions in terms of how to address it. Okay, and with that, here's a couple ways to find me. I'm not terribly difficult to find online. And again, I'm Stephen O'Grady, co-founder of Redmond, and very much appreciate your time.